નમસ્કાર વિદ્યાર્થી મિત્રો, વિરામ બાદ આપ સૌનું ફરી એક વખત હાર્દિક સ્વાગત છે. વિદ્યાર્થી મિત્રો, આપ જાણો છો તેમ આપણે આજે MA ઇંગ્લિશ અંતર્ગત MEG 1ની ચર્ચા કરી રહ્યા છીએ. MEG 1માં વિષય નિષ્ણાત તરીકે આપણી સાથે અહીં સ્ટુડિયોમાં ઉપસ્થિત છે ડૉક્ટર સંજય મુખર્જી સર. મુખર્જી સર, ફરી એક વખત આપનું હાર્દિક સ્વાગત છે.
થેન્ક યુ.
આ બીજા સત્રમાં આપણે અહીં શરૂઆત કરીએ એ પહેલાં હું આપને અમારા સ્ટુડિયોના ફોન નંબર્સ જણાવી દઉં. 232 13 096, 232 13 097, 232 13 101 અને 232 13 102 આ ફેક્સ નંબર છે. વિદ્યાર્થી મિત્રો, આ ફેક્સ નંબર અને ફોન નંબર્સનો ઉપયોગ આપ 2 કલાક સુધી હજી કરી શકો છો. અમે દરમિયાનમાં અમારી ચર્ચાની શરૂઆત કરીએ છીએ. હું મુખર્જી સરને વિનંતી કરું કે એવો પરામર્શનને આગળ વધારે. મુખર્જી સર.
Thank you. Dear student friends, we left off at an important junction when we were trying to understand how the period Romanticism could be described if not properly defined. The problem was with defining the period, and no one definition really sufficed it, and therefore we are taking the aid of two very important 20th century critics in order to understand how they described this period. We stopped by looking at the 5 important points given by the noted 20th century critic M.H. Abrams. Now we go over to the 5 points given by Margaret Drabble in her The Oxford Companion to English Literature. That also is a book. If you chance upon it in some library, please refer to it. It is a book that would be helpful to you for your entire MEG course and not just the Romantic period. So now if we move on to Margaret Drabble's 5 points on Romanticism, which would be flashed on your screen, you will find that intellectually Margaret Drabble distinguishes the period in terms of the intellect, the politics, the emotional aspect, so on and so forth. So you will find that the first point that she mentions is that intellectually Romanticism reacted against what is called the late 18th century empirical scientific movement called the Enlightenment. Politically, it was inspired by the revolutions and the freedom movement in America and France. Emotionally, it expressed and asserted the self, the value of the self and the individual experience, and equated the individual experience with the transcendental or the experience of the infinite. And socially, it championed progressive causes. Therefore, all reforms, all the revolution that was supported, they were supported by the Romantic poets. That was the cause of it. Socially championing of the progressive causes. And finally, Drabble talks about a stylistic aspect, a literary aspect, and that is again our important vocabulary word comes back to us, that is Romanticism stylistically is attached with emotional intensity and with imagination. So these are the points given by these two critics, M.H. Abrams as well as Margaret Drabble. Now we have to talk, before we move on to the particular poets, about the other influences that happened during this period. Romanticism is not only Great Britain based. It is said that Romanticism was actually the germinating place of Romanticism was actually Germany. And from Germany, an important figure, Goethe, Johann Wolfgang Goethe, who is now on your screen, you see he comes out as a very important, the foremost representative of the German Romantic movement. And his masterpiece, Faust, you will recollect that Marlowe had written a play, Dr. Faustus, and Faust is a poetic drama that Goethe writes, which again not only just revives the legend of Faust, but it becomes as if an allegory of human life in all its various ramifications. This is an important aspect which we need to talk about. Goethe's this work, Faust. Also, the emphasis that Goethe put in through his literary works on the power of the individual, the self, and the desire to challenge the hitherto existing corrupt social norms, and the spirit of individualism that comes out from his work. That is another influence that travels across the continent of Europe and comes to England in the English writers. Goethe, of course, took great deal of inspiration from Shakespeare and tried often to write in the free, in the untrammeled, in the natural way that Shakespeare could write. If we can use a term that is generally described for Chaucer, giving us God's plenty in his plays. That is what Goethe was also inspired by Shakespeare. Goethe is now, if you again look at your screen, is associated what is called at that point of time a movement in German literature called the Sturm und Drang movement, that is the storm and the stress movement. The storm and the stress movement is often considered to be a forerunner movement to Romanticism, to German Romanticism, and then to Romanticism in general. In his work Goetz von Berlichingen in 1773, he presents a robber knight and and justifies revolt against the political authority, which in a way inaugurated the storm and the stress movement. His other work, Goethe's other work, is The Sorrows of Young Werther, that is translated and published in 1779 in Germany. It was published in 1774, and this young Werther was also in this tradition, and this also becomes a very important literary document which often goes to an extreme. That is, for example, it justifies suicide for unrequited love, but in a way then it triggers the intense emotional, that passion that is associated with Romanticism, that is associated with personal frenzy, that is associated with melancholy and the weariness, and what perhaps in another talk we would discuss that we find in the heroes created by Byron, or that became what is called the Byronic hero tendencies, that it was derived from Goethe's work, the young Werther. This is another important influence that comes apart from Goethe is from the French philosopher thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau's famous statement that man was born free but he is everywhere in chains, and that is why he went against the what is he called the corrupt, the civilized, modern corrupt civilized society, and believed that individuals should go back to nature. One should not take the phrase literally, going back to nature, not just literally going back to the wilderness, abandoning society, but going back to one's own nature. That is, his belief in the natural innocence that pervaded his ideas about education, society, as well as fiction, that governed his principles, which in turn immensely influenced the Romantic period there and the writers and the intellectuals in Europe. Therefore, from Goethe and Rousseau, we have the continental influence, and this also is important in order to holistically understand Romanticism. Now, our slideshow will end, and then I will move on to the three poets by talking about some interesting facts. You will find that as far back as in 1936, a critic called F.L. Lukács, in his The Decline and the Fall of the Romantic Ideal, listed 11,396 definitions of Romanticism. In this regard, we talked about that how difficult it is to define Romanticism, and as you see that in 1936 a critic gives you more than 11,000 definitions, and so if we are talking about today's time, 2007, certainly then we would have more than 20,000 definitions of Romanticism. Therefore, once again, to remind you, the period is a problem as well as the definitions are a problem when we talk about Romantic period. Another trivia fact, again when you look at the screen, is that the 1800 preface, we talked about Wordsworth's definition of poetry from the preface of the second edition of Lyrical Ballads. The 1800 preface, actually it is often mentioned as 1800 preface, but the interesting detail is that it was not published in 1800, but it was published in January 1801. Also, Wordsworth's very famous, characteristically romantic Tintern Abbey, when you read, would have actually no mention of the abbey at all. The abbey, as you know, is a monastery, a place where monks or nuns study. Another important trivia, very curious trivia fact, is that when Blake died in 1827, Blake, we will come to discuss, he was not a wealthy man, and when he died, Mrs. Blake was left a very poor woman. Therefore, she tried to supplement generate some kind of an income by working as a housekeeper in one of Blake's friends' houses, named the Tatham household. Now, Tatham inherited Blake's paintings and Blake's books, but he then, when he reviewed them, when he saw them, many of them he burnt because they did not apparently fit with his notions of propriety. The last trivia is from Coleridge's Kubla Khan, which when you study, you will generally come across that most people talk about this poem as a dream poem induced by opium, that Coleridge was in the habit of taking opium for initially to cure his rheumatic pains, and then of course he became an addict to opium. And this is the poem Kubla Khan is often taken as a dream poem induced by opium. But an American researcher and scholar in 1927 wrote a book called The Road to Xanadu, and there this researcher researches that when Coleridge was writing this poem, at around the same time he was actually reading a travel book about a Turkish traveler named Kublai Khan. So it might not be an altogether fantastic imaginary dream poem after all. It might be the poem generated by Coleridge's own reading of a travel book. So these are some of the important, interesting facts that also make our reading of any literary period all the more enchanting. We now move over to deal with the poets in particular. And in your MEG 6th course booklet, you have William Blake, William Wordsworth, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge taken together. It's very difficult to bring these three great poets in one booklet, and that's a great achievement that your study material has done, to summarize, to talk about their important poems and their characteristic style. And in this short lecture series, we will also have to take recourse to some kind of generalization, some kind of summary, which might be opening certain windows of debate later on when you study them. But for the moment, let us look at these three poets in a broad general sense. The first is our William Blake, who is, as we discussed, he is talked about as often, he is clubbed with the first generation romantics, but often he is talked about as a precursor to the romantic poets. So, we talk about him as often as the precursor to the English romantic poets. Blake himself was a poet, painter and engraver who created a unique form of illustrated verse. His poetry, inspired by mystical vision, is among the most original, lyrical and prophetic in the language. He was an isolated figure, much neglected and not much understood by his contemporaries, and cut off from the main currents of his time. He had very little formal education, yet taught himself not only several languages like Greek, Latin, Hebrew, French and Italian besides English, but also trained as an etcher and engraver under a famous engraver, James Besire. Throughout his life, he made his living as an engraver, achieving only modest intermittent success, thus remaining economically unsound all his life. He remained poor. It was in his 60s that he gained a modicum of recognition from a younger circle of mostly artists and visionaries, not from the poets, not from the fellow poets. He gained a reputation much after his death through the Pre-Raphaelites, for whom he was a beacon of inspiration, and then in the mid-19th century through Swinburne, and finally in the 20th century through W.B. Yeats, a fellow symbolist and visionary. Now it is said that Blake had visions even when he was a small boy, and he could cultivate this faculty carefully. This talent of his, what is called eidetic imagery, photographic imagery. In his poetry, he could cultivate that in his poetry and painting. He was a Christian but belonging to the dissenting tradition. Politically, he was a radical, and he was sympathetic to American and French revolutions and to the spirit of freedom wherever he found it. Although he is known to have painted and illustrated more than 200 works, especially on biblical themes, his literary fame now rests on his magnum opus, Songs of Innocence and Experience, which collectively got published in 1794. Now, I will give you a small thing on the screen, and then you will be able to see that this is finally, you are on Blake. I will give you a small record of his works, and these works, if you now look at your screen, there are some 8 works that are there, and these 8 works are the works which make him famous. Of course, we are discussing William Blake's work here, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. But if I quickly make a rundown of his works, then he wrote The Marriage of Heaven and Hell in 1792, America, a Prophecy in 1793, Visions of the Daughters of Albion in 1793, Europe, a Prophecy in 1794, Urizen, Book 1, 1794, The Song of Laws or the Book of Laws in 1795, Laocoon in 1815, and Jerusalem. These are some of his important works that we find, and we are discussing his work Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. We will go over to his poem The Lamb. And William Blake actually can be read and interpreted variously. He can be read at a political level, he can be read at a psychological level, he can be interpreted, that is, mythologically, archetypically. But any great writer, any great author has this quality. It is not that one can slot a particular author into a particular type. One can really interpret any good writer, any good artist from various perspectives, and that also is the quality that Blake had. Let us look at his poem, The Lamb. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bid thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead? Gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing, woolly bright? Gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice? Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Little lamb, I'll tell thee. Little lamb, I'll tell thee. He is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek and he is mild. He became a little child. I a child, and thou a lamb. We are called by his name. Little lamb, God bless thee. Little lamb, God bless thee. And you will find a little illustration of Blake as we discussed in his small biographical sketch. This is an illustration that Blake himself did. The technique is called engraving and etching. So, as we just discussed, he earned his living as an engraver more than as a poet. Now, if you look at this poem, you will find that once again, if you look, this poem has so many questions. And in fact, in the first stanza itself, you will find the first line opens with a question, then the first stanza ends with a question, then again the second stanza begins with a question, there is another question, and if you count the questions, there would be quite a few. What is the meaning of all these questions? Actually, William Blake invites us to dwell upon the image of the Lamb, which in turn invites us to use the image as a means of asking questions about the whole of the creation and the Creator. The insistent question, as you can see in the poem, is who made thee? Is not asked to the Lamb, but it is actually asked to all the people of his times, especially as a reminder to those sunk in the travails of war or industrial labor, that there remains a more innocent world which still can be seen by cleansing our doors of perception. The narrator, I in the poem, calls himself a child, which actually affronts our adult rational mind until we realize that the underlying emphasis is on at least two views: that each one of us is merely a child in the eyes of the Creator, and B, that the poet conveys the message that retention of an innocence even in the adult world makes this place a better and a blessed one. This poem, The Lamb, is generally contrasted with Blake's the other poem, The Tiger. And you will notice that the tiger by Blake is spelt differently. It is not with an I, it is not Tiger, but it is spelt Tyger. Mark the long syllable. Mark the long syllable when we say Ty, tiger, 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 burning bright. And when we look at the poem, and I'll read out the poem for you. This is perhaps one of the most well-known poems in English literature. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burned the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? I shall read out to you. This poem can open up into endless discussion, but in order to save time, I shall read out to you a very fine analysis of this poem by a critic called David Punter, which will serve as a model as to how to make a close reading of a poem. To make a close reading of a poem is a painstaking task, but it gives a lot of joy and satisfaction in the end, besides making us fall in love with what is considered perhaps the most difficult genre of literature, that is poetry. And here I read out the little 1.5 page write-up by David Punter on the tiger. And he writes, perhaps Blake's best known poem, The Tiger, is ruled by symmetry. Symmetry between the stanzas, between lines, within lines. Yet, for this very reason, one of the details which leaps immediately to our attention is the lack of symmetry between the first and the last stanzas, where a single word, could, in stanza 1 is changed to dare in stanza 6. To confront this change is immediately to ask crucial questions of the poem, and indeed of the tiger. For what in the poem has led us to regard the tiger under an aspect which makes us dare to approach it? The answer, of course, is that the tiger has been portrayed in a curious term as a dread beast. Dread in English is one of those rare words that can mean its own opposite, both fearsome and fearing. So, the question immediately follows, what is being feared here by whom? And why? Or, to put it another way, what does this tiger represent? And thus, what might it mean to try to frame the tiger's fearful symmetry? The poem suggests two answers, and in doing so proposes a whole theory of the human and the divine. For, on one interpretation, of course, the tiger, like all other beasts and like man himself, has been framed, in the sense of made by God. And the poem does not deny this, even though it refuses to name the answer to the question. But on the other interpretation, the responsibility for framing the tiger, in the sense now of converting him into a work of art, rests not with God but with the artist, the poet. In this sense, you find that there is a similarity when Blake asks the lamb the question, "Little lamb, dost thou know who made thee?" One answer would obviously be, the Creator created the lamb. But who made the lamb on this page? Who engraved the lamb, the picture that you saw? Who did it? That is the Creator on earth that Blake wants to perhaps indicate. The Creator on earth is the poet or the writer. The same theory goes for tiger. Tiger has been framed or created by God, but the tiger that you see specifically the tiger in these many stanzas. You see the tiger with a change of spelling. This tiger on your page, this tiger that you hear right now, is a creation by a poet called William Blake. And therefore we may see Blake's poem as asking a reflexive question about the role of the writer and about the writer's and artist's relation with the untamable materials of the imagination with which he works. What might these untamable materials be? Well, they clearly might simply be the wild itself, wild nature, the beast out there, but they might equally well and as well refer to the wild inside, the beast within, the unconscious within us all, that compound of desires and drives which always and everywhere rises up to upset the attempted rule of framing reason. Thus the tiger stands as an emblem for energy, for a power which, while in one important sense symmetrical, that is to say perfectly formed, is also beyond all framing, control or capture. The fires with which the tiger burns are thus both the fires of that which is unapproachable, unassailable, that which is forever hidden in the forests of the night, its stripes blending perfectly with its jungle backdrop, and at the same time the fires of the creative soul burning with the desire to frame, create an image. This image, the poem appears to tell us, cannot in the end fully be made. There is no real possibility of capturing the tiger with pen or with paint, and yet, and paradoxically at the same time, the very act of naming the impossibility of capturing the tiger actually captures it. So that in this poem, as in the accompanying illustration, we do indeed, and despite everything, see the tiger. Blake, like he illustrated the lamb, he also illustrated the tiger in the same way. He drew an etching and he engraved his own poems. And we hear it too, the dull threatening stamp of the lines, the repetition of dread. These are precisely the incarnation of the tiger's walk out from the jungle to meet us, the irrepressibility of the tiger within us all, and at the same time the terror of the artist confronted with the internal nature which he tries at the same time to suppress and to represent. And this brings us to what many critics have considered to be the crux of the poem, which occurs in the 5th stanza, when the stars threw down their spheres. If you look at your screen now, the lines are appearing. When the stars threw down their spheres and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Often considered as the most important stanza in this poem. When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, what mood are they doing that? We have to ask the question, are they throwing down their spears in the sense of attempting to ambush their mighty earthbound opponent? or are they throwing down their spears in the sense we might use today, throwing in the towel, that is, abandoning all hope of divine angelic supremacy in the face of a power which, while perhaps uncomprehending of its own strength, is nonetheless far more mighty than they? Who is really in charge here, the stars or the tiger? And by the same token, we might ask, who is in charge in writing of a poem, the painting of a picture, the human being who attempts to capture the world outside with pen or brush, or the wild material itself which will continually outpace any attempt to render reality in artistic or textual form? And we may go on to ask, who gets to smile at this process? Perhaps God smiles, or perhaps He does not. When He compares His work of making the tiger with the gentler work of making the lamb, or perhaps He does indeed smile upon the tiger, but only with a smile of irony, because He sees in the tiger precisely the equivalent of a force of destruction. Is the tiger, we might finally ask, a natural or an unnatural beast? Natural, of course, for tigers are real. They do exist, and they resist all attempts to tame them. But here, the tiger is unreal too. He is a made beast, and made in a quite specific way. Made with, for example, hammer, chain and anvil, made with all the apparatus of human making, and thus some critics have been led to see in the tiger a figure for a monster, a specific monster constructed from bits and pieces, an emblem for the industrial revolution and for the kind of making which man might indeed achieve, but which might swiftly move out of control, if indeed it is not out of control already. A final question. In one copy of the poem, Blake altered line 12 from "what dread hand and what dread feet" to "what dread hand formed thy dread feet." What effect does this change have on the poem? What effect does it have on our ideas of the stability of any poem? Do we believe that individual poems are laid down for all time? Or can they be altered, as Blake was continually altering much of his own work? This is one of the many questions with which Blake confronts us, and it is relevant to the overall theme of the tiger, which we might think is all about stability and instability, reason and energy, that which will always exceed our attempt to frame a reasonable explanation of life. This was, I thought, a very good explanation, very good analysis of the poem, a very important poem, not only in the canon of romantic poetry, but it is one of the most importantly anthologized English poems, and it is perhaps William Blake's, by now considered the most important poem. Well, man has been central to Blake's vision, and therefore Blake is the most extreme humanist of all time. Thus the terms human and divine are interchangeable for him. This is most clearly evident in his poem The Divine Image, which portrays the doctrine to which Blake was to hold throughout his time and his life, namely that God has a human form. We need not be scared, because the whole of God's creation is essentially in human shape. Mercy, pity, peace and love were cardinal virtues for Blake. We might contrast them, for example, with apparently stronger or more masculine virtues such as courage and righteous anger. In this poem, he claims that these are all of human form, but simultaneously he gives us evidence of this by portraying the emotions themselves as anthropomorphic. Blake might be saying that when we live by these virtues, we are doing our best to aspire to divinity. God does not dwell in the deeps of the universe, but in the everyday acts of kindness and compassion which link us to each other and to the rest of the sentient universe, which itself is diverse and consists of people belonging to non-Christian faiths too. Blake's sympathy with and inclusiveness of people of other faiths is matched by his deep concern and sensitive portrayal of the downtrodden and the have-nots in the society, like the chimney sweepers and the London prostitutes. The Chimney Sweeper, as well as London, both capture the reality of the dark underbelly of the industrial and urban centres of England, like London, Manchester, Liverpool, etc. Though slotted in the Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, respectively, both these poems make us respond with pity towards the hapless victims of the society, but more than that, they provoke us to think whether the seemingly positive societal institutions like the church collude with other forms of exploitation and tyranny in offering us false pleasures which merely serve to ensure that we do not challenge the validity of these institutions. Both the poems strive to look beneath the surface complacencies. The Chimney Sweeper questions the promise of paradise in the other world, thereby implicitly validating the wrongs of this one. And London goads us to ask why in the first place soldiers line up seeking employment to fight another's war before we reflexively react in a pacifist manner. Thus, Blake's complex symbolism and esoteric vision might be a difficulty for us readers to grasp the full import of his works, but certain characteristics are beyond doubt, and here I am summing up Blake as a poet. His boldness to condemn the conventional powers that be in his time, his constant urge to cohere his thoughts into a system which did not look at the distant Greek civilization to manifest themselves, but sought to locate them in acts of negotiation within his own Christian tradition. His compassion for those who are on the margin of existence in terms of gender, age and class, and his ultimate hope against all odds in humanity. This is briefly, really briefly, how we can sum up William Blake, taking recourse to the poems that you have to read in your course material. We now move over to William Wordsworth, and after reading William Wordsworth's brief biography, we can take another short break. For William Wordsworth's biography, I have not selected the usual way people describe that biography, that biographical details you will find in your course material. I am picking up William Wordsworth as the writer in those formative years when he decisively decided to be a poet. So I am picking up from his teen age. William Wordsworth, 1770 to 1850. He, by the way, was the longest living romantic poet, who was in France for more than a year between, so I am picking up William Wordsworth from 1791. He is born in 1770, remember. Who was in France for more than a year between 1791-92, leaving Cambridge to perfect his French better, and madly in love with a French lady, Annette Vallon, perhaps with the idea of settling in France, witnessed the revolution firsthand, supported it actively, almost putting his life into peril, and was deeply distressed at the way the hope of founding a new society vanished when an upstart emperor was crowned by a captive pope in 1805. But one good thing came out of Wordsworth's French period: his realization that the purpose of his life, his calling, was to be a poet. In fact, he started getting his poems published as early as 1793, noteworthy among his initial phase being Written in Very Early Youth, An Evening Walk, and Descriptive Sketches, where a reader might get an early sign of his yet to fully unfold poetic genius. Wordsworth first met Coleridge in 1795, and by 1797 the Wordsworths, that is Dorothy and William, and Coleridge became neighbours at Dorset in the Lake District, and for some time held common ideas regarding poetry, poetic material, and the role of a poet in the society. It is here that the plan to jointly publish a collection of poems that would be different from the style in vogue during that time germinated between Wordsworth and Coleridge. This was the genesis of lyrical ballads. A ballad comes from the Latin, again etymology. We are going to take the etymology of the word ballad. The ballad comes from the Latin word ballare, B-A-L-L-A-R-E, meaning to dance. Essentially, a ballad is a story meant to be sung with musical accompaniment for dance. Ballads are of three types: the folk or the traditional ballad, the literary ballad, and the popular ballad, which is different from the first in the sense that it is meant for the semi-literate or literate class of urban people and not the rural folk. Lyrical ballads belongs to the second category. This anthology contained, that is lyrical ballads, contained Wordsworth's by now recognized signature poem, Lines Written a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, which however does not neatly fit into the ballad form, and therefore is an example of the romantic tendency of altering traditional forms because of its deep ruminating nature and its unrhymed blank verse style. Wordsworth had toured this place, this abbey, a monastery or a nunnery, on the banks of the River Wye, and revisited it again, as he mentions in the poem 5 years later, this time accompanied by his sister Dorothy, in the month of July 1798, when the place was in its summer bloom. Wordsworth later mentioned to his nephew Christopher Wordsworth about this poem. You see, in your syllabus, you have Wordsworth's Prelude, which is a very, very long poem. We will talk about the Prelude a little later, but all critics of Wordsworth agree that the germ of Prelude, if one has to understand, then the germ lies in the poem Tintern Abbey. So, in our discussion of Wordsworth, we have to consider Tintern Abbey first and then move over to the Prelude. So, after we come back from our short break, what we will do is that we will hear what Wordsworth has to say about his very satisfying moments of creating Tintern Abbey. While he created Tintern Abbey almost impromptu while he was in 3 to 4 days walk in the Lake District. He kept on walking and kept on jotting, forming the lines in his mind, and when he came back from the walk, he sat down and at one stretch he wrote the poem, and as he says, he did not alter it then. It is for Wordsworth, according to, and he is gone on records saying, one of his most satisfying poems. It is for all readers of Wordsworth, for all readers of English poetry, one of the most important romantic poems, characteristic romantic poems. We will come back to it after a short break. Thank you.
વિદ્યાર્થી મિત્રો, બીજા કલાકને અંતે ચર્ચામાં અહીં એક નાનકડો બ્રેક લઈએ છીએ. માત્ર 5 મિનિટના વિરામ બાદ મળીએ અને આજ ચર્ચાને આગળ વધારીએ છીએ. નમસ્કાર.